All right. It looks like we're live. Welcome, everyone. We'll be getting started shortly. Thank you so much for joining us here at our Black Lives Matter Community Forum. You're going to be engaging in a discussion with some amazing people, and you can join this discussion as well. So I see that folks are joining us. Thank you so much. What I'd love for you to do is type into the comments whether you're watching this live or you're watching it on replay. Type into the comments where you're logging in from and what brought you here. I'd love to hear that and get to know you a little bit better. So today we are gathering to cut across all kinds of barriers for a cross-cultural and interdenominational conversation with the Reverend Sandie Richards. And I'm here today with Sandie, and together we're going to explore, Scott, together we're going to explore what we can do to both recognize and combat systemic racism in the U.S. Welcome, Sandie.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy Jo.
So what I'd like to do is get started by having us both introduce ourselves. And Sandie, why don't you get started
Okay.
and introduce yourself, talk about where you're coming from, who you are, and what this means to you.
Absolutely. So I'm Reverend Sandie Richards, a Methodist minister here in Southern California, and I do work with lots of interfaith communities. As Amy Jo has said, this is me with my rabbi friend Neil, and we do a lot of work on justice issues such as living wages, combating gun violence, and racial justice. So and yeah, that's me, and I love doing the work with all my friends here in Southern California and across the globe.
And I know that one of the quotes that you've shared with me about how you feel is, I want white people, including me, to learn more about our nation's history. It
That's
isn't
it.
black, you like to say, it isn't black history, it's everyone's history. What do you mean
Everyone's
by
history.
that?
So the United States of America has a history, and it is all of our history. It's not just Black history or Black people's history. The history of Black people in America is American history, and we should all know it, especially white people, because we're the ones who know the least about the history of Black people in America.
Right. And that's why we're here today. So thank you for educating us.
Sure.
And now I'll introduce myself and why I'm here, where I'm coming from. So I am a Jewish woman, the child, my grandparents escaped from Russia and Hungary and Poland in the early 1900s in the pogroms, just like these people. If you've seen Fiddler on the Roof, that was the story of my family. And so I grew up with a lot of awareness of the Holocaust, but I also grew up here in America with white skin. And I married a Korean Presbyterian who's the son of a minister. And that was a real blending, but we have a wonderful marriage of 24 years. These are our mixed race kids. And we live very much in a world, his family are up from the bootstraps immigrants that came from nothing, from Korea by way of Hawaii. And we are absolutely feeling the solidarity of wanting the strength of America, which is immigrants getting the job done, to really be what we're here talking about. And what I'm here to do is to learn more about how to be anti-racist and what that means, and challenge myself to be more actively anti-racist, not just embracing. I have, the way I personally run my business is very international across these are the people we work with. They are all races, all colors, and it's very educational, invigorating for me. And we cut across gender, race, country. And our game thinking community, these are the faces of our community. And that's why I'm here, is that's where my heart is, that's where my work is, that's the throbbing heart of my business. And I'm here to bring that energy to what I can do to be anti-racist and truly part of the solution. So one of the things that I've learned from you, Sandie,
Mhm.
is what the Second Amendment actually is. All of us have heard Trump call out, "Hey, my Second Amendment people," and the Second Amendment, this and that, and then we get into arguments, on Facebook about what that actually means.
Right,
And you educated me about what that actually means.
right.
What is it that you would like all us white people to know and all us Americans to know
Right.
about where the Second Amendment comes from and how it's used on the trigger finger happy radical right, how it's used in those circles and what it means.
Right. So the Second Amendment is become quite complicated, but it has a very simple beginning. In the early days of the colonies, they wanted to they wanted to have a well-regulated militia. It says, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And the right of the people is where it begins and ends right there. The people who were supposed to be the ready militia were gun carrying white men who quelled Indian uprisings. Now we would say Native American uprisings, but Indian uprisings, and kept slaves under control. Enslaved people were powerful, and the white people who enslaved them feared an uprising. So it was up to it was everyone's civic duty, every man's civic duty, white man's civic duty, to own a gun and to make sure that if they ran across an enslaved person on the road, for instance, that they had to check for weapons, check for ID, make sure that, and you can see in this picture that the men are on horses with guns, and the enslaved men are showing their ID, and there's dogs and everything, and it's just anyway. So it's the origins of policing, can be called in the this early form of American policing. There's in fact something from the law enforcement museum where a woman wrote an article saying that the slave patrols were an early form of American policing, and that the threads of the controlling of enslaved people became the threads of it controlling Black people, and all the way down through today, where white men feel and white women feel like they can control and police Black bodies.
So, how does that connect with the over policing we see in Black communities and the blatantly different treatment that so many of us have heard and been shocked by, and yet Black people are like, why are you shocked?
Yeah.
How does that connect?
Well, I can only speak from my perspective as a white person learning. So I'm learning, but it connects because we see in our society Black bodies as suspect. If we see them on the road, they must be doing something wrong, or we have to make sure they're not doing something wrong. And that fear of the white slavers that they had about uprising and policing Black bodies, it was severe. And so they had to quell their fear by attacking Black bodies to subjugate and control. And so I feel like that thread continues all the way through in a straight line until today, when we see, um, white men feel like they can just shoot a Black man if he's jogging, because he, quote, fits a description, or something like that. So I don't know if anybody saw the YouTube video where there was a man being harassed by the police in one of the marches, and he kept saying, "I'm not the guy you're looking for." And they pulled out his ID and he was FBI, and they were shocked. And yeah, he was looking at the camera saying, "Wait till you see this." And so no matter what you are, if you are law enforcement yourself, if you are a fine, upstanding citizen, if you are Black, you are suspect. I'm not hearing you. I think you're muted.
There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a heartbreaking story I heard yesterday in a forum I went to that was sponsored by Black VC, which is an organization to get more Black people into venture capital. And one young man who had lived in Canada for many years moved to Palo Alto. I mean, top schools, incredibly well spoken, well presented, put together. He moved to Palo Alto. Palo Alto, a mile from Sand Hill Road. And he was driving down the street with his girlfriend and stopped at a red light. And the police were behind him and they came up and like pulled them over because they had heard there was some Black guy, you know. And within seconds, they had him on the street with his face pressed in the pavement and a gun to the back of his neck. And he was just like,
Yeah.
oh my God. And then he's like, if you want to understand white privilege, boy, is that a moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, you know, that it connects to what we're talking about. And that's the original sin, the racist DNA in our country that we're all facing. And as they say, you can't fix it if you don't face it. And that is there along with all the noble-minded writings of the founders. It's there.
Right. It's
and
absolutely
things
there.
and it's not just America. All and it doesn't excuse America, and we're here to really deal with America's racism and the roots, but all countries through time have enslaved people when they could, and it's horrible and it's very human. People do that. But then people rise up. Us Jews have stories in our core holidays. It's pretty much they tried to make us slaves, but then we got away, let's eat. That's pretty much what our holidays are, right? And so we feel that, but in a very different way. And here in America, because of the color of our skin, we don't feel it in the same way. And so the Second Amendment, when Trump calls out to his Second Amendment people, who's he talking to?
Yeah, he's definitely talking to the people who feel like they're carrying guns to maintain a ready militia. And those ready militias are not necessarily sanctioned by the state. They're not necessarily our armed forces or our police, although there are obviously infiltrations of armed forces and police by white supremacists who use those positions once again to oppress people of color. And so when Trump calls out to his Second Amendment people, he means the people who showed up, for instance, at the Michigan State House armed to protest, when they were really there to intimidate. And I think that that is what the president means unequivocally. And if you doubt it, you just have to look at his own history of racism and hatred of people of color to understand that he has not yet turned the page.
Right. So a lot of us with kids are fielding a lot of questions these days that, they're hearing a lot of things. And some questions like, why did they kill that man, mommy, are so hard to answer. But some other questions have historical context that are helping our kids level up and become anti-racist. Let's talk about Jim Crow. My daughter the other day said, "What? I heard Jim Crow. What is that? What is Jim Crow? What's the role of Jim Crow in the Civil War and the Reconstruction and Jim Crow? What is that? And why is it still relevant to us to know about today?"
Well, Jim Crow. So let's start with Reconstruction. In the period immediately following the Civil War, the Republicans of the North were sure to aid the freedmen of the South, the people who had formerly been enslaved or who had been freedmen before the Civil War. And those people the freedmen were gaining in wealth, in political power. Within a few years after emancipation, they were in state houses of government, they were in federal houses of government, and they were rising. They were buying land and building homes and farming themselves and doing very well. And they began to do so well that an organization you might have heard of called the Ku Klux Klan began to attack and burn down homes and threaten people who wanted to vote and threaten men who wanted to run for office. And basically the Republican North had gotten what it wanted politically out of the whole thing, and they stopped protecting the men of the South, the freedmen of the South. So what sprang up were a whole bunch of new laws called Jim Crow laws, and Jim Crow was a minstrel star, I think, in the early 30s. But they, with colored waiting rooms and white waiting rooms, colored schools, white schools, colored drinking fountains, white drinking fountains, and back of the bus for people of color, front of the bus for white people. We know what this is because it lasted for a long time, all the way through the 60s, and it tacitly exists today. If you are, like your friend, a Black man in a white, quote unquote, community, then you will pretty soon find out that you don't belong there, or that they don't think you belong there. So that's what the Jim Crow laws were for, was to put the people of color back under the thumb. And I'd like to say something briefly about the 13th Amendment too, because it's really important. The 13th Amendment freed the slave people. It outlawed slavery, except if you were convicted of a felony. Now, you may or may not have actually committed a felony, but a jury of white men, not your peers, could convict you, and then you could be on a chain gang in a prison yard. And so we're all familiar with the idea of chain gangs along the roads of Alabama and other places in the South, because they were convicted of a felony and re-enslaved. And so there was a lot of free labor. And even today, prisoners are made to labor for pennies an hour, and not to really earn money for their families, perhaps, or for maybe one day when they're freed from prison. So we have today now what's called the new Jim Crow, which is the mass incarceration of Black bodies for cheap labor. So
what you're saying is that there's a long history of that. This isn't new.
No.
What you're essentially saying is, when people talk about systemic racism and institutional racism, this is what you're talking
what we're talking about. And we're all affected by it, even if we don't understand or know it. And so that when you talk about being anti-racist, that's such an important thing. And we're going to talk about Ibram X. Kendi a little bit later, but he has a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is such a helpful distinction, because we all have a little racism in us, and we can't be non-racist, but we can be anti-racist and on the road to ending racism. So we need to be aware of where the roots of it are and how it got started and how it persists today, or we'll be very ineffective in interrupting it and stopping it.
So one of the biggest insights that I've had as we've talked over the years, and you've educated me with your perspective, which adds to my perspective as a Jewish person.
Right.
It has been the threat of Black excellence. And, there's this pattern of assuming Black men in particular, but Black people in general, are somehow up to no good, and we're going to police them and terrorize them. Whether or not we stop them and pull them over and let them go, they're terrorized.
Yeah.
And so that is a state of mind that makes it harder for you to be excellent when you're terrorized. We're all feeling that right now. It's really hard to really step up to your best self when your country is under a military rule,
Right.
But so there's that. But and then the Tulsa Massacre, which we can talk about briefly, and the Jim Crow laws. You really connected. Those laws didn't come out of nowhere. Those laws came out of the burgeoning threat of Black excellence. And so in America, what we see is, if you're a sports star, you're okay. If you're an entertainer, we love that. If you are a powerful businessman who might take market share from me, or make me somehow look smaller by comparison, even though I'm white, I will explode with rage.
Right.
And Maya Angelou said something that really moved me and helped me. She said, I always felt secretly, internally, morally superior to racists of all kinds, particularly white ones, but she said of all kinds,
Mhm.
because the thing about being a racist is you're artificially propping yourself up,
Mhm.
and it's just not true. Like, you're artificially propping yourself up with a not truth. And if you let that go, if you actually like evolve as a person and
Mhm.
let that go, who are you?
Right.
How's who are you without that? Without that, I'm better than you artificial prop up. And then when I learned about the Tulsa Massacre and all this other stuff, it started to kind of come together in my heart.
Right. So the Tulsa Massacre happened in the 20s, and it uh, was called Black Wall Street. It was a very wealthy neighborhood of Tulsa, Black neighborhood, and it was burned to the ground one night, just literally burned to the ground by white supremacists. And obviously taking away the wealth that had been built by the Black people who lived there, and taking away their ability to work and do what they needed to do. Their Black owned businesses were destroyed, their homes gone, if they owned automobiles. And so you can't be a wealthy Black person in Tulsa in the 20s, or they will burn you down. So that's part of it. And the other thing that comes to mind when we think of fear of Black excellence, or keeping Black excellence down, is an example from Malcolm X's life, but it can be so many other Black people I know, even my peers, even to this day. It persists that Malcolm X said he wanted, when he was in 8th grade, he was smart enough to be the valedictorian, and he was saying he wanted to be a lawyer. And his teacher told him, no, you can't be a lawyer. Sorry, you got to be a janitor. You'll never make it as a lawyer. And when you see the self-taught Malcolm X, the self-educated, the way he spoke, the way his rhetoric was so powerful, imagine him, as an attorney. He had a different path, obviously, but he would have made a brilliant attorney. And that teacher was so afraid of Black excellence that the teacher had to say, no, you can be a janitor.
Wow. But this week, they shared a heartbreaking story with George Floyd's second grade teacher, where he wrote an essay about wanting to be a Supreme Court judge.
Mm-hmm. I didn't see that.
And
Wow.
yeah. So let's talk about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King.
Okay.
Another thing a lot of us parents are hearing is our kids are
Oh.
and people sometimes polarize them and mistake them and caricature them. I know you've studied this a lot. You've been through seminary. You work with Black leaders. You're one of the few white people that gets included and recognized in South Compton in events. So that's part of why I brought you on today, is that you work with Black leaders and you know what it takes to do that. And
Yeah.
you've studied this stuff. So
Yeah.
from that position, tell us about MLK and Malcolm X and kind of your take on their impact, what they were trying to do, where they
Right.
overlapped, where they were different.
So it's interesting because we're still arguing these same two polarities today, as far as nonviolent resistance and self-defense. Even in the 60s, with the Black Panthers in the 70s, like they were saying, that in California they carried guns. The Black Panthers did, for self-defense. And Malcolm X said, he would defend himself and his family by any means necessary. Whereas Dr. King said, I would, nonviolent resistance, direct resistance, direct action, nonviolent direct action was the way to go. And so their movements would have debates. Like Malcolm X would debate Bayard Rustin, who was one of the men in the entourage of MLK. And Bayard Rustin was a gay man, a Black man, and he actually organized the March on Washington. So a little shout out to Bayard. But the two men were on the same side of making sure Black dignity and Black lives were put onto a better footing in this whole society. They both were coming against white society from different directions. This is the one and only time they met. They didn't really know each other. very well, but they'd studied each other clearly. But this was a photo op that got put together. And so I think it's a precious one for all of us to see these two great men side by side. However different, you can see like in the way they're looking at each other that they are not enemies, that they are admirers of one another, even though they debated strongly strategy and the way that things should go forward in the future. So yeah, so there they are, Malcolm and Martin. And you know, we have all of Martin Luther King's beautiful speeches. We have many. If you've not seen Malcolm X speak, he's on YouTube all over the place, and I highly recommend people go on YouTube and listen to him. He was put down in my household for being violent, a violent Black man. But when I grew up and read about him, I understood more that he was not a violent Black man, that he was a fervent and passionate Black man for the freedom of his people. And that he later became more inclusive in his ideology after he went to Mecca and he learned that Islam, you know, people of Islam came in all different colors from all different nations, and it sort of broadened his view. It didn't soften his idea of what needed to happen in the United States of America, but it did soften, I think, his movement. And sadly, both of them were killed. So both of them were murdered. And it's really dangerous to put yourself on the line the way these two men did. But they both brought so much to our nation and continue to, their legacies continue.
So a lot of people have confusion around the Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. And I see this myself in my own world.
Mm-hmm.
I see this with my family members. I see this with the nice liberal Jewish lady down the street.
Sure.
I share my passion. I share, hey, we're doing a Black Lives Matter event. And the immediate knee-jerk, but All Lives Matter. And it's so connected to assumptions people make about that statement.
Mm-hmm.
How do you answer that? How do you I had some of that initial feeling. I understand now. You wouldn't go to a cancer fundraiser and stand up and yell, all diseases matter.
Right. Exactly.
Right?
Right.
So
right.
What are you seeing in your world and how do you answer it?
Yeah, the All Lives Matter thing is very frustrating because what I said to a guy that I used to be at a church in East Hollywood, and one of my East Hollywood former parishioners put on Facebook when I put, you know, Black Lives Matter, he posted All Lives Matter. And I said, all lives matter to God, but Black lives don't matter to all people in America. Like, we need to stand up for Black lives, because if Black lives mattered the way all lives matter, then we'd be fine. But in fact, we single out Black lives because we see how throughout history and today, Black people are in a place where we need to say, no, their lives matter and we got to do something about it, because we have left them in terrible straits for too long with stress of over policing, stress of poverty, inability to build wealth because of redlining, and you know, if somebody burns down your father's house, you can't inherit it, right? So you know, the inability to build wealth, the inability to bank, the inability to, you know, just do. Even in, like, if you go to South LA today, that it's a food desert. There's not supermarkets. And one of my other parishioners said, well, they burned down the supermarkets. And I was like, that was 28 years ago. Like, we really have to say that people deserve decent grocery stores in their neighborhoods, like, or we can't blame them for not eating, quote, healthy foods if they're not available. Farm workers, and I alluded to the fact that Black people were the farm workers in most of America for most of our history. Now, of course, we see that farm workers have been Mexican, Latino, and farm workers have been Filipino and Chinese and other nationalities. But in reality, we think so little of people that do farm work, that they were excluded from the Fair Labor Act, and they were excluded from minimum wage, and they are excluded from all kinds of protections. if that's the case, how are people ever supposed to build wealth if they aren't even allowed to have a minimum wage law that applies to them? So, and black people are underpaid compared to white people. Black people are, I mean, I could go on and on and on. And the stress of being over policed and having no health care in their neighborhoods, or very little health care in their neighborhoods, the fact that they can't get access to health care, even if there is health care in their neighborhoods, the fact that Black women, when they come in pain to a doctor, they are not believed because there's this belief from slavery days that Black women didn't feel pain. Can you imagine that? So they can't get medicines they need, they can't get health care they need, they can't get help when they're giving birth. So maternal mortality is very high for Black women. I could go on and on with statistics. I could go on and on with all of that, but all it leads to is it leads to stress, diabetes, all the kinds of things that happen to people when their lives are devalued, and even just living life is a challenge every day. Which is not to say that Black life is terrible. I mean, obviously, Black people have given so much to our culture and to our nation, so much artistically, so much creatively, so much politically, so much socially. The contributions of the Black community far outstrip what you might think, given the oppression and the pushback we have given them. So I think we need to value Black lives on every level. And yes, all lives matter, but all lives aren't oppressed the way Black lives are. I'm sorry, I got on a bit of a soapbox there.
No sorry needed. No apology needed. That was awesome. More of that. Yeah. Amen. Amen, sister. So let's talk about what white people like you and me. Here we are, two white ladies, Jewish, a Jewish lady, a Jewish game designer from Silicon Valley, and a Methodist minister from
I'm
a
a
largely Latino community. Yeah,
yes,
white Protestant.
I'm definitely a white Protestant. Yes.
Here we are, but we're trying. We're trying. Okay. So let's talk about being anti-racist. Let's talk about what we've learned. Let's talk about what we can do. Let's end with concrete steps. I am a huge fan of actionable steps.
Right.
So one of the things you and I have talked a lot about, and I really feel, is follow emerging leaders. Amplify all this week. I've been amplifying Black voices. I've been listening, learning, and observing, learning, amplifying, understanding, all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But I also, and I'm seeing, I mean, this is a scary ass week, especially if you're a student of history. This is a very scary week.
Yes.
My daughter asked me to look up fascism. That was fun. I looked it up. I read it to her from Wikipedia. She looked at me. She's 13, guys. She looked at me. She said, all of that's happening right now. And I said, you see more clearly than most people around me.
Mm-hmm.
That's the week we had. So what can white people do to be more anti-racist? Part of what we can do is we can elevate and follow and amplify leaders.
Right.
And a lot of the leaders I'm seeing are young. You know what moved me? And so I'm amplifying them. I'm following them. I'm looking for leaders. Some of who moved me this week. And by the way, people in our audience, I want you to get ready. I want you to type into the chat, who moved you this week? What leaders are you amplifying? Who are you seeing that you want to step up and follow and amplify so that we can build our coalition and not fall prey to the ugly racist DNA driving this ugliness of police brutality and unfairness, and instead link arms as immigrants and protect and lift up our great country. Who are you following? Where are the leaders? So you know who I'm seeing? I'm seeing a bunch of 17-year-old Black girls. The girl, check it out, people. The girl who filmed, the person, the human who filmed George Floyd being murdered, who stood her ground while the police threatened her with mace. Can you imagine? It was a 17-year-old Black girl, And she stood her ground and she filmed that, and everything changed because she did that. Can you imagine the courage to do that? A 17-year-old Black girl organized 3,000 people in San Francisco yesterday for a peaceful protest. These people give me hope.
Yeah,
I'm amplifying them.
absolutely.
I'm following them. I'm taking my cues from them. Joe Biden is our presidential candidate. Boy, is he imperfect. People are calling for him to resign. Is he imperfect? Oh my God. But then I heard Black people say he took all his cues from a Black man. And we respect him for that. He didn't correct the Black man. He took his cues from the Black man.
Right.
That's where I'm coming from with understanding what anti-racism is. Don't insert myself, take my cues. Find some leaders I can take my cues from.
Right.
Like Joe Biden did.
Yes, exactly. And I feel like one of the reasons we're doing this evening is because we really want to talk to white people. Like, we don't need to educate Black people. They are educating us. And one of the voices I love the most is Jelani Cobb, who was a professor, and he now writes for the New Yorker, and he's on newscasts, and he is such a great thinker, and he points things out historically and in the current world and what we can do about it to change. And he's someone I definitely want to take cues from. I'm a huge fan of Kamala Harris and her rhetoric. She is a really, really quick on her feet kind of person, and she's always ready. She's always prepared. Like today, when they were talking about in the Senate, we still can't have an anti-lynching bill for some reason. Maybe that's one thing white people could do, is just bombard Rand Paul with the idea that he should, take his foot off the neck of this legislation, if you'll pardon my brutality of words. But he's blocking anti-lynching legislation, and she just stood up and gave him what for, and she was right on all counts. Remarkable. I'm loving Stacey Abrams. She got cheated out of an election in Georgia and stood right back up and said, well, I'm going to work on people's right to vote. And she stood right up and has been a voice for change and a voice for, she didn't have sour grapes. Her integrity and her character are extraordinary. And so I'm just a big fan of hers. And Cory Booker I like because he's a guy who he still lives in his neighborhood in Newark, his rough neighborhood in Newark. He sees the loving way to do things. He speaks with the language of love and of peace and of community. And I just appreciate that grace. So these are 4 of the people I'm taking my cues from, but there are so many more. And I'm really blessed to have so many leaders in the LA community that I'm friends with and have worked with for years. And we know and trust each other, and I'm taking my cues from them as well. So
that's awesome, Sandie.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to hear from you. If you're just joining us, we're here with Reverend Sandie Richards from Los Angeles, and we're talking about what we as white people and as all children of God, and you don't have to be religious to be a child of God.
Right.
So I gotta say, there's so much to learn, but some of what moved me this week was there's a sheriff. So there's the police brutality we've seen.
Right.
Is, let's call it eye-opening, and let's also call it uneven.
Mm-hmm.
I saw videos of police warning the white supremacist armed Proud Boys to hide while they tear gassed the protesters so they could then come out and hurt them. I saw that. And then I also saw the Houston police chief, Art Avesito, give the most impassioned talks.
Mm-hmm.
And what he said was, I saw, that was so wrong. That was so wrong. That is our brother. We are all children of God. And that man called out for his mother. That was me. That was my mother. He brought me to tears. And I'm not super religious, but I understand what it means to see the world as we're all children of God.
Right.
And that's why you and I connect.
Yeah.
And that is as real as the police brutality.
Mhm.
That is he called, and then I saw another, then I started following him and I started seeing what he retweeted. And then
Mhm.
I saw another one of a Mexican American policeman dressed in riot gear comforting a 5-year-old black child who thought he would shoot her.
Oh,
And my daughter said, "How can you like those police? All the police are pigs." A
wow.
cab, a cab,
Wow.
and but it's systemic.
Mhm. Right.
Of course, my brother-in-law, my niece's husband is the most honorable and decent guy, and he's a
Mhm.
policeman. We all know in your town, the
Right.
policemen are So they talked about community policing, relational policing.
Mhm.
That's a positive vision of where we could go. People
Right.
from the community elevated to serve and support. This morning, I had I have several groups of people that I coach. I've been doing a lot of coaching people through really hard emotions this week. And one of the groups of people I coach are a bunch of female product leaders, and they're from all over the world. Um, and one of them is from Switzerland. And she told me what it looks like from Zurich, Switzerland, to look at the
Mhm.
US right now and see what's going on. And she said, our hearts go out to you. And you know what? We have a good relationship with the police here in Switzerland because they all come from the community.
Mhm.
And I thought about Art Avocito. And I thought, how can we empower the Art Avocitos structurally and systemically?
Right. 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 Well, I don't have the answer yet. I don't think any of us does, but one of the things that is really important is to hire the right people. Like, make sure that you're not hiring people with racist backgrounds or with racist ideology. Make sure that you're hiring people that are community minded as well as police minded. I understand that when you're out there as a police officer, things can be dangerous. We had, in the COVID lockdown, we've had an uprising in domestic violence cases, and 4 of our police officers responded to one, and 2 of them got injured and couldn't go to work. So, it is a dangerous job, but we have to make sure that they're in the community enough that they don't see everybody as a criminal. And we have to sort of call out, not sort of, we have to actually call out bad behavior and watch statistics and see if, like, all you're doing is pulling over black people. That's a problem, or brown people. So there has to be a series of steps taken, I think. Data, hire the right people, get them out in the community, and help your police officers see the community not as an enemy, but as a community that there's mutual support there.
That's what Kevin from Switzerland said. She said, "We see the police as working for us."
Yeah, right. Well, and they're also pretty racially singular, so that's another
Yeah,
issue.
although she said there are. I mean, countries are different. There's all kinds of
Yes,
issues. There's issues of scale. I mean,
yes,
part of what's challenging about the US is how big we are.
yeah, right,
Socialism, if you look around the world, socialism works mostly in smaller countries that are
right,
pretty homogeneous.
right.
That might not be a coincidence.
Yeah, it
But,
might not be.
again, all of us parents, what can we do? Why are we here today? We're here to educate ourselves. We're here
Right.
to educate you. We're here to educate each other.
And learn,
This
yeah.
week, this week, my daughter said to me, "What is socialism?" We looked it up. What is fascism? We looked it up. What are the hallmarks of democracy? We looked it up.
Mhm.
What are the ways in which communism has been both demonized and practiced successfully?
Mhm.
And you know what our conclusion was? So much of it, just like Montessori schools, are in the way it's practiced.
Right.
It's such a great example. think about, we do a lot of work in education at Game Thinking Corp here, at the Game Thinking headquarters. And think about Montessori. It's such a beautiful and powerful set of practices, set of ideologies. It's beautiful. You know what? Karl Marx's writings are beautiful. They're deeply felt. They should work. But then there's human nature.
Right.
And it gets practice. Is communism working in China? It's a particular form expressed in a particular way. Why didn't communism work in Russia? What is going on in the US that we demonize socialism and then give all these handouts? It's
Right.
just, but yet we don't have a social net.
Right.
When we talk about systemic racism, these are the issues that we end up with.
Right.
Right?
Right, right. And I always say the problem with anything is human greed, human, the inability of human beings to see one another with light and love in our eyes, the inability of us to understand that we are a collection of influences, some of which we consciously take in and some of which are subconscious and given to us by society. They say by age 3, children are already acting out racial ideas. Like they're already getting it at age 3 from the ether, from the systems that are in place. And they're sponges. They're listening to everything they see and hear, and they're trying to make sense of it. And so, we see these pictures of these little tykes, like black and white together, hugging each other. And it's so sweet. And that's what we need to remember, but we don't. We get very jaded, and we get very afraid of, we're afraid of things that we shouldn't be afraid of. And so we, in our fear, strike out and lash out, like those slave owners of old who were afraid that their slaves would rise up. And many times the slaves did rise up, because guess what? It's no fun to work 12 hours a day, 8 days a week, and get beaten when you're not producing, and, have women be sexually assaulted by, a variety of white men on the plantation. And, that kind of treatment of people, it's interesting that the oppressor fears the oppressed so much that there's all of this way to keep them down, instead of just reaching the hand and recognizing each other's humanity, working hard to be anti-racist and rooted out within our own hearts, as well as the systems we have engendered as a society.
This week, we were treated to Donald Trump finally getting his wall, and 2 layers this week,
right?
2 layers of, okay, let's talk signaling. This week, 2 layers of fences went up around the presidential residence of a president that's calling for armed insurrection among a shrinking racial minority.
Mm-hmm. Right?
Where have we seen that before in history and around the globe?
Yeah, it's terrifying to me, to be honest. What gives me hope is the hope in the broader community that people have been marching for 9 days already, and with no signs of stopping, for, against what we've been talking about today, against racism and anti-Black sentiments. But yeah, it's very scary to see the White House become a bunker. It's very scary to see unmarked law enforcement officers. Like you don't know what branch they're from. You don't know what their names are.
Well, they're hired thugs. So unmarked police, unmarked, heavily armed police officers outside of bunkered location of the leader,
right,
is a signal in and of itself.
It is.
It's
to
a
me,
signal.
Yeah, to me, it bespeaks of fear And that's what I'm saying. Like the White House and the president are two of the most highly guarded things there are. Like, it's, I don't know where you can be safer, but he had to put
So,
all that stuff around him.
right. So that this week, and it was so enlightening for me to hear the report from my client in Switzerland and my client in Nigeria and my client in France. And it's why I love having an international business. They tell me what they think. And you know what they think? They're heartbroken. They believe in the dream of America.
Mhm.
And they're heartbroken to see it go the way of other failed democracies. And
Mhm.
they see and they know the history of failed democracies. Democracy is fragile. And when my daughter and I looked up the definition of fascism, you know what was the first item on the list?
Right.
A belief that representative democracy is a failure.
That's right.
That
I remember
representative
that.
democracy doesn't work. That's not item number one. Item number two was autocratic ruler, often accompanied by family members.
Mhm. Mhm.
Item number three, let's talk, pattern recognition. Item
Mhm.
number three is a show of military force to intimidate and communicate the spin message of make the country great.
Mhm.
Usually during a particularly low time, a depression, an economic depression, a say terrible health issue,
Mhm.
such as we're in now.
Right.
So these things happen at a low point. There's a crack in the fabric of society.
Mhm.
And in that crack, an autocratic ruler can come in with a message that's all spin.
Right.
And what's disturbing to all of us, I think, is that this message is coming in at this point with a reality TV star with a fake persona propped up by the
Mhm.
most powerful persuasion engine we've ever seen,
Mhm.
Facebook,
Right.
and a complicit, for whatever reason, the reason doesn't matter, a completely complicit leader who drapes very manipulative algorithms in free speech, um, in a free speech excuse.
Right.
And I design social engagement systems for a living.
So this is your wheelhouse.
And I see it. The people at the good people, the children of God. I think the reason you and I connect is that children of God means the good people, the people that see the humanity in other people.
Mhm. Right.
That doesn't have to happen in a church. That's
No.
why, you know what, Sandy, you told me something that blew my mind the other day. You told me that all of the donations to your church are up now that you're not meeting in person.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Children of
Peop
God don't need a place. They don't need that. They are good people that want to do the right
Right.
thing.
Well, I might say we need a place too, but we don't only need a place. Like, we need sacred spaces. Whether you're a person of faith or not, you need a place to go for your soul to heal, and you need a place that's safe and wonderful to do that in. But it doesn't have to be you don't have to be a church going person to be a person who will help us make what we call in Christian terms the beloved community. We want to make sure that everybody has a safe and welcome space to be who they are, who God created them to be, with all of the creativity, beauty, awe, wonder, and uniqueness of each person. And then we want to come together, which is what you feel in your international business cohort, just the beauty of the diversity is so amazing. And it is such a beautiful snapshot of whatever you think the sacred is. It's a beautiful snapshot of the sacred when we come all together in our differences. And so that's one thing I really, really love about working in an interfaith and community for justice, is that we are working together to make sure that the dignity of each human being is upheld. And that right now, it's the dignity of Black lives, because they are in danger, both socially and politically. We are.
Say more. Say more. Black
Well,
lives are in danger.
Black lives
Oh
are in
my
danger.
fucking God! Pardon me for screaming.
I'll edit that out.
I mean, here we are, two white ladies, and
Right.
you know what? We link arms with everybody who is horrified, horrified, horrified.
Right.
So
Right.
tell us what you mean. Black lives are in danger.
Right. Well, I mean, they have been since the beginning of our nation, since people came from, Africa in chains. I mean, their lives were in danger when they got on the boat, and to this day, we haven't figured out a way to make Black lives safe. We haven't figured it out. And back to Malcolm X, Malcolm X was all for. His father was part of the Marcus Garvey Back to Africa movement. Malcolm X, his stance was that Black communities should be for, by, and of themselves, and just separate from everybody else, because that would be the safe way to do things. That would be the right way to do things. And then white supremacists can carry on in their own little area. Black people could carry on in their area. And, there would be safety in that. Of course, I don't think that's a very practical thing, but it came from that place of being in jeopardy, being in danger. So being in danger from, we referred to it earlier, health issues, living in high crime neighborhoods, often because those neighborhoods were neglected, jobless, a lot of despair, lots of stress in a high crime neighborhood, by the way. And so you grow up traumatized, and not only traumatized by perhaps the crime in your neighborhood that are committed by, neighbors perhaps, but the crime in your neighborhood that's committed by what are often called the third gang or the second gang, which would be the police. Now, that's not true in my neighborhood, but it could be true in other people's neighborhoods, that the police are a source of fear. So
it's uneven.
Yeah, it is very uneven.
It's uneven.
Go. I was going to say,
what
I love about the fact that it's uneven is that there are places where we're doing better. So we can do better. And we ought to do better.
Right. Talk to me about what's working in your neighborhood.
Well, our police force is not a force. They are a community-minded, community active group of men and women. They're very diverse, and it's top down. The chief of police here is super kind, very, very community minded, always out in the community. And if somebody were to do something untoward toward a community member that was uncalled for, that person would be disciplined. Like, they just don't put up with things. So the fact that it's a small town and people know each other, and people, the police know a lot of us, like we know a lot of them and they know a lot of us. It's a small police department. And like you said, maybe that's part of the key, is having it be smaller. Maybe the city of Los Angeles is just too huge. Maybe, the city of Houston, maybe those cities are just too huge. But
so it's scale and leadership. So let's talk about two things. Let's get very specific. I'm really into action. Mm-hmm. What can we do? Let's talk scale and let's talk leadership. Sandie and I are here today to provide leadership, to provide a forum, to provide co-education, to level ourselves up, to build our knowledge, and to build our coalition.
So are we ready?
We are not going anywhere. No. We are not abandoning the farm to the white supremacists.
No, we are not. No, not on my watch. I wonder if this
Exactly.
might be a good time to move toward the resources that have been helpful to us.
Yeah, let's do it. And I've said, so everybody listening, post in the comments or join us in StreamYard. You'll be backstage, so don't worry. If you join, we can put you on stage. But we'd love to include you if you'd like to join and be either audio or video on site. We shared a link in the comments. If you want to just share your comment in text, we'll read it out loud. We'd love for you to participate, but boy, do we have a lot to say.
Yeah,
So
we
you
do.
go, you do you, and we'll keep providing resources and education because that's what we're here to do, to level up each other,
Okay,
okay?
so the
And to
first,
build our coalition.
I think a really good resource for white people is a book by Robin DiAngelo called White Fragility: Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. My favorite chapter, because I cried at every racism talk, like meeting I've ever been to, is called White Women's Tears, and why we should, you know, not try to break down in tears. When white women get mad, what we do is we cry. It's not a good thing, but we need to hold back our tears so it doesn't become about us. It becomes about the community. Like, when I'm crying, I need to be comforted. No, no, no. Stick your courage to the sticking post and go without crying if you can. Or if you start to cry, just don't make it about you. Move on. And but that's not all there is in the book. It's really, really good. Another one is Tears. Oh, The American Nightmare. This is an excellent article just out June 1st. So it's fresh off the presses. The American Nightmare: To Be Black and Conscious of Anti-Black Racism is to Stare into the Mirror of Your Own Extinction. This is Ibram X. Kendi is one of those up and coming voices. He's been around a while. He's wrote a really great book called How to Be Anti-Racist, which is on back order, but I highly recommend you get it. This is about how racial disparities have been historically connected to, instead of connected to situations and policies, historically they've been connected to the Black body itself, the failure of a Black race. And he digs into that, and I think it's very important for white people to read this and understand that. The next resource I think that's really helpful is Tears We Cannot Stop: A Sermon to White America by Michael Eric Dyson. It's basically a lovely sermon. It's written in a sermon form. And Michael Eric Dyson is a premier leader in the Black community and helping white people to understand how to be anti-racist as well. And talking about why the Black community is continually struggling against racism and what we can do about it as white people. Another excellent resource is this is a 4-hour documentary on PBS. You can stream it right now. It's amazing. It talks about Reconstruction, America after the Civil War, and you can read it, or you can learn about how it is that Black people thrived for a while, and then they were looted and had their possessions and their political power removed from them through Jim Crow. Very important 4 hours and very informative about a period of history we don't know much about. This is really excellent. The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration by Michelle Alexander. I alluded to the 13th Amendment and incarceration, and she breaks it down so amazingly for our modern era, like why Jim Crow is still around and why we need to combat it, what we can do to combat it. So I highly recommend that book. So those are just a few. There's so many that we can do, so many ways to go. The other thing is, if in your community there isn't like a showing up for racial justice or something like that, you can start one, or you can find one. Now we're all finding out about Zoom. You can find a few like-minded people to get together and talk and really listen to your Black friends. White people keep their mouth shut and listen to their Black friends and their friends of color describe what's going on and describe their feelings, describe their experiences, and simply listen and receive. Simply understand from their perspective what they're going through without defensiveness, without argument, without getting too overexcited about what we could do to change. Just listen to what they have to say, and then listen to what they think we need to do to change, because they've been thinking about it a long time and they have a lot to say. We have a lot to learn. So those are my resources.
That's really beautiful. So I want to share something and tell a story about oh, I see. It seems to I see. I will try this. Let me try this. Do you
There you
see
go. Yes.
yellow peril supports black power? We can see. So we all have a vector, a North Star, a purpose, something that moves us. And I care a lot about the world my children are inheriting. And I care a lot about, we run a purposefully very cross-cultural international business because it educates me and enriches me and makes me a better person. And when earlier, we shared that I married a Korean Presbyterian and I'm a Eastern European Jew. And it turns out I was born in Japan. My dad was in the Air Force. And I grew up imprinting like a duck in Conrad Lorenz studies on Asian people. And I've always felt very comfortable around Asian people and very embracing of everything about Asian people. And until I was 2, I was totally surrounded by Asian people. I married a really wonderful Korean who's running by the way, the graphics here. And I don't usually say I married a Korean. How many times have I said I married a Korean to you, Sandie, in all the years I've known you?
Yeah, not a lot.
But right now is a time when immigrants are linking arms. Art Avocito in Houston is like, we are all immigrants, including you Black people who were brought here against your will, and we built this place and we're not going anywhere.
Right.
Scott's ancestors. One day when I was, let me stop sharing because we seem to be having trouble. But one day when I was just getting to know Scott and we were dating, I went to a family dinner and a family brunch actually with all of his Korean relatives. And I sat next to delightful Auntie Esther. And Auntie Esther is Scott's mom's sister-in-law. And she told me stories about growing up in Modesto in middle California, right? Farm working communities, hardworking immigrants, discriminated against. And she told me about people calling her Eskimo. She goes, yeah, they thought I looked like an Eskimo and we couldn't come in the theater on Saturdays. And she's smiling the whole time and we're having a lovely brunch. And she's telling me about it. And she's telling me about, the comfort women in the World War II and, being Korean and realizing that they could be enslaved and be prostitutes.
Mm-hmm. And
the way in which they experienced the kind of racism that happened post World War II and the shameful racism of imprisoning Japanese and Asian people in World War II. Mm-hmm. That they experienced, that George Takei speaks about so movingly, that he, had a Broadway show about, mm-hmm. that was, by the way, produced by Jewish people, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where you and I connect, is that it's like, that's where we all link arms and say, who made this country great?
Right. Absolutely. Who built the White House that is now surrounded by it's built like the ancestors of the people who are protesting for Black lives. The Black people protesting for Black lives built the White House, built the Hall of Congress, built Washington, D.C., built by, like, they had to cut huge slabs of stone and like move them to the place of construction, and they had to, like, they worked hard. They were enslaved and they worked hard, and their legacy to us is evident. To us as United States Americans, the legacy of the Black labor that built this country is still ours to enjoy. And that is part of the problem, I think, that we haven't looked at, is that it's billions of dollars of free labor in building our nation that Black people endured as enslaved people. And we don't even want to acknowledge that. We don't want to talk about reparations. We don't want to talk about anything, because we don't want to acknowledge the value that this nation has built on the backs of Black people, and yes, Chinese people, and yes,
Koreans,
Japanese people, and Koreans, and
right,
Latino people, immigrants
currently.
Yeah.
And
So it goes, yeah.
And so we have a question. JC is asking, what percentage of white people do you think are racist? Or is it all white Americans? Are white people inherently racist? So I want to take a crack at it, and then I want to hand it over to you, Sandie.
Okay.
By the way, that sign in the back that you see, no justice, no peace, my mixed race daughter made, and she dragged me to a protest she wanted to represent. She did research on what it would take to deal with tear gas. And on the way to the protest, you know what she said to me? Mom, do you think I can pass as white? Am I going to get in trouble?
Oh, man.
Hello, I'm just sharing with you my reality. JC says, what percentage of white people do you think are racist? Is it all white Americans? Are white people inherently racist? You know what, JC? We are about to find out.
Yeah.
Here's what I think. I think that a lot of it's cultural, and I think it's inherited, and they learn it at the table. And I also think that there's a seed of racism that's in every culture. I mean, let me speak as somebody who married into being a Korean. All kinds of Korean and Chinese and Japanese people think they're absolutely the best race. No question. Do they enslave other people? Not currently, but the Japanese tried to enslave the Koreans. It's like, and if you talk to Chinese, and honestly, it's like, there's all kinds of racism that goes on between the Chinese and the Malaysians in Kuala Lumpur. I ran into it when I was there. There's so much human nature around that. Lots of races like to think they're superior.
Right.
It's very human. Are all white people racist? I think no. I married a Korean and my kids can't pass as white. Sandie here, very not racist. Part of why I'm not racist is how I was raised. Part of why I'm not racist is because I'm really into human potential, and being racist is stupid if you're into human potential. It's just not the right algorithm.
Mm-hmm. That's said by a Silicon Valley startup.
There's
like
a lot
the
of
data.
There's a lot of not racist people in Silicon Valley that feel like I do. When I have a meeting like I had with my Polish immigrant and Swiss student and Arkansas, dweller this morning, I am very much into human potential and learning and growing and, frankly, being anti-racist. I think being anti-racist is good business, and it makes me grow and it makes me a better person. That's why I'm into it.
Ibram X. Kendi, that I was referring to earlier, that we looked at his article in the Atlantic, is very helpful on this question, because he says all people are racist. Like, all people need to be anti-racist, not non-racist, because non-racist is almost impossible for the human community, because, as Amy Jo said, we look at differences and we want to believe certain things about certain races, but in reality, what we want to be is anti-racist, whether we ourselves are racist or not. And and now is the moment to talk about white privilege, which we mentioned before, which is I, as a white woman, when I was in seminary, I had a good friend who was Black. I grew up in a poor neighborhood with a lot of crime and so forth. She grew up in a nice neighborhood, went to a very upscale private girls' school, very well educated. I was well educated too, but she was incredibly well educated, incredibly smart, incredibly beautiful. And when we went to like Bloomingdale's or Macy's together, she would get followed and I would not. And if you looked at our backgrounds, you might think I would be the one tempted to steal something because I didn't have a lot of financial resources. She could buy anything she wanted, but she was the one who was followed. So that is a racist system, not a racist, like, am I racist? No, but I did not recognize that my friend had to go through that situation. So that's what we mean when we say white privilege. It doesn't mean I didn't suffer growing up. It doesn't mean I didn't, struggle. It just means I didn't have the system working against my color by assuming that I would be not a thief and my Black friend would be a thief or might be a thief.
So all this week, Seth Meyers has been opening his show by starting with Amber Ruffin, their amazing, talented, wonderful Black writer, sharing stories from her encounters with police. And they bring to life exactly what you were just talking about, Sandie. And I've been watching every day. And I'm fascinated to see how all the different late night hosts who are all adapting to work from home COVID, now they're adapting to this and they're deciding how they want to respond to all the signals of authoritarianism and coded white supremacist violence. And it's frankly not even all that coded.
No, it's not.
And so Seth's response is, and I love pop culture. I'm a huge fan. And, I just also want to share something. So my experience with Black culture started, frankly, in high school. And I had two things. I was a very musical kid. I was kind of a musical prodigy, but my parents put me in classical music, and then there was a competition, and then I always came in second in this like California-wide competition because there was this other good kid, and I fucking hated it. I hated it because I love music and I love collaborating. I didn't want it to be a competition. And in high school, I saw Black students who were bussed into our super white affluent high school in the Pacific Palisades. I saw them perform dances to Stevie Wonder's Superstition. And as a musician, I went, how come nobody ever told me about that? That's so much better than what I'm learning. Like, whoa, seriously. And I just went way down a funk rabbit hole and got way into Parliament Funkadelic and got into the bass and was like, oh my God, and went way into Black music. So I, like many white people, came into appreciating Black culture through music. And appreciated doesn't even begin to describe my feelings about it. It's like completely in awe and schooled and like, I don't even understand complexity as somebody who was trained in classical music. Now that I understand African drumming and salsa, you're talking 22-piece orchestras with polyrhythms and multitonal. Oh my God, it's more advanced than anything I ever learned in classical. And so as a musician, I was respectful was the start of it. And then it was just show me the way. This is the way. And I feel that way now. And I'm channeling that that about how I feel about leaders. And thank you for sharing all those resources.
Sure.
So I don't know what percentage of white people are racist. We're going to find out. Thank you for the question. If there's any
Yeah.
more questions, let us know, because
Yeah,
we're going
we
to be
kind of
closing
went.
up pretty soon.
Yeah.
And by the way, cheers, everybody. Happy Friday. Don't ever be afraid to stand up for what you believe in.
Right.
And we'll probably do this again if you like it. If you have any more questions, type them into the chat. We're listening.
Yeah, we're listening.
So I think, here's what I think. I think there's probably some really racist ass people, and I think they're propped up by it. I think they learned it at the dinner table. I think they are, as Maya Angelou observed, small and propping themselves up with that. That's my hope. I think there's a big group of people that could be swayed. And I think part of the problem is that people don't understand what systemic even means.
Right.
And they can be swayed by an enemy and by simple messages like Hitler used.
Right.
Study Hitler.
Yes.
Study the Reichstag Fire. Let's talk about the Reichstag Fire for a brief minute.
Sure.
So thank you, Sandie, for schooling us on Black history. It's really important. It's our history. It's not just Black history. It's American history.
Right.
American history.
And I actually don't know enough yet. Like I know a little, but I need to know more.
Right. So in Temple, when I was a teenager and a young person, we saw videos of bodies in the Holocaust being bulldozed into mass graves. They let us know what happened. And I didn't pay that much attention because I was a teenager and it was really disturbing, actually. But recently, and just in terms of history, I have become more aware of my own history and parallels. And I want to tell you a little about the Reichstag Fire. So in 1933, 4 months after Hitler took power with a very, very persuasive, ahead of its time PR campaign, 4 weeks after Hitler took power, there was a mysterious fire at the Berlin Parliament, and it completely burned down. They blamed the communists. They suspended the Constitution. They created a police state. They suspended civil rights. They suppressed the free press. All of the worker-oriented free press went out of business. The only press that maintained itself was the press that echoed and amplified the party line. This week, the New York Times, without reading it, published a racist call to violent arms by a U.S. senator. That's signaling. This week, Facebook employees, for the 4th or 5th time, with increasing urgency, communicated to their leader that they were inflaming and not just neutrally free of speeching, which is bullshit. I'm a designer of engagement systems. I know what those are. I'm a game designer. With increasing urgency, the past employees and the current employees of Facebook are beseeching their leader not to amplify a message that is ultimately a call to civil war. And instead of listening, the leader is couching what is ultimately an economically very profitable relationship in free speech. And that's where we find ourselves today, Friday, June 5th. And so part of why Sandie and I decided to exercise our free speech and step up and share this with you. And thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Yeah. We look forward to doing more of this if you enjoyed this.
Yeah.
But we decided to do this because the story is not written yet. And immigrants get the job done.
Amen. Good old Hamilton. Amy Jo, you're
What do you
muted.
want to say in closing, Sandie?
In closing, I want to say how grateful I am for the forum of this moment and for the people who are listening in. We love to hear comments. We're going to come back and read them. So give us your comments. And it's just been an honor to think through some of these issues with you, Amy Jo. And yeah, I hope we do this again, and maybe we pick other subjects, but this is a very good, very important subject right now. I just want to end by giving a shout out to all my fellow children of God, beautiful people. Let's make these things better. Let's do better, because we can.
You know, Sandie, I remember when I first met you, and I was introduced to you as the Methodist wife of a comic.
Yeah.
When we met in LA. And I thought, God, and our sons were friends. And I thought, what will we have in common? But part of what we have in common is we're both children of God.
Yeah.
And we're both, and I think that's a powerful phrase. And to answer JC, to answer your question about racist people, I think there's a lot of people that in their hearts are children of God and can be persuaded to not be racist and to bring everybody up. And part of why I believe that, and part of why I connect with Sandie, and part of why you are probably listening to this, if you're coming from my audience, is that I'm a cooperative game designer. I'm a game designer. I'm a startup coach. I support teams to reach their goals. But the hits I've worked on and the systems I've built and my expertise is in cooperative game design. And I understand the difference between zero-sum games and non-zero-sum games or positive-sum games. And the narrative that we are being fed right now is a zero-sum game. And that's a narrative that's frankly easy. It gets people inflamed. It's really easy. If you're a game designer, zero-sum games are easier to implement than non-zero-sum games. It turns out. And non-zero-sum games can be harder to maintain. But non-zero-sum games, which include everything Sandie does, is a non-zero-sum game.
Yeah, sorry.
Trade is a non-zero-sum game. Creating a bigger pie that's shared by everybody. The belief of people that create non-zero-sum games is that if you play that game, you create a bigger pie for everyone. Right. The belief of people that create zero-sum games is that there's a very limited pie. And if you don't grab your share through whatever means necessary, it's going to be grabbed away from you. It plays to our deepest instincts for human survival. But it also ignores what moves all human civilizations forward, which is non-zero-sum games, which is trade, which is creating a bigger pie. And what Sandie and I and everybody who actually uses game thinking in the proper way is all about is banding together to create a bigger pie for everybody. That's what Black Lives Matter is ultimately all about. That's what every one of you is here is all about. And I believe that there are ways to have the shrinking, racist, hate-filled, trigger-happy minority. I think there are ways to get them to implode on themselves and show us just how small they truly are. And I want to leave you with that hopeful message. Go look up psychological operations and asymmetric warfare. It will serve you well. Any thoughts on that, Sandie?
I think we could do a whole nother,
Sandie?
we could do a whole nother 90 minutes on that. Yeah, I just think that there are people who are in such a mindset that we can't win them, but we can outnumber them, as you said, and we can outthink them, we can out strategize, and we will. I don't want to use the word win because that's such a zero sum term, but we will thrive, and we will move forward in history, and we will thrive, all working together. And I know we can do it because we are doing it, and we have done it, and we are doing it, and we will do it until we prevail over hatred.
Part of what systemic change means is creating policy. Part of
Right,
what systemic change means is empowering the good stuff that's happening.
right.
Part of what systemic change means is understanding systems.
Yes.
So if you want to understand more about systems and hear more like this, leave us a comment and tell us what you want to hear more about. And we will plan some more updates.
Plan some more
Thank you.
updates.
Thank you, Lisa, for your comment that it was enlightening. Thank you, Sandie, for enlightening me.
Thank you, Amy Jo, for enlightening me, as always. And thanks to everybody. Continue to leave comments. We're going to come back and look at them. So, see you
All
then.
right. And if you guys are interested, next week, we can go deep into what you can do that involves no guns, no violence, all psyops. Let us know if you're interested.
Yeah.
Peace out. Peace
Peace
out.
out.